Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Trevor. You've been an absolutely incredible support to 4SA. Dan as well, thank you so much for your amazing support. We've now been working together in the fight for faith and freedom for many, many years. So unfortunately, it's not a fight that ever, I think, is going to be won. I think we're always going to be doing whatever we can to protect and promote religious freedom. And that, of course, is exactly what 4SA does. That's what we stand for. Our little slogan is the fight for faith and freedom. And yes, it's certainly something that is important that we know about, because obviously we need to be aware of these things. We need to understand the times in which we live, and we need to know what we can do about what is happening. We don't just want to be sitting there kind of like sideswiped and suddenly wake up to find ourselves living in a reality that we never obviously want to live in, which is where we find it increasingly difficult to particularly express our faith, to live it out in public, and not just in the privacy of our own homes or within our own churches. And that's a very critical issue that we are always looking out for. 4SA is, in a very real sense, just to repeat, I'm sure some of you know this already, but we are effectively like the watchmen on the walls. We track everything that is coming out of Parliament, out of government departments, every policy. We keep an eye on what's going on in the courts, and everywhere we see the potential threat of an erosion to faith and freedom, that's where we get engaged. And there are some pretty big things that have happened and are happening at the moment that we're going to take a few minutes today to cover. But I want to particularly welcome and introduce you to my colleague who is on this call, Noble Kosi Zulu. Noble, are you there? There you are. Wonderful. Noble is currently in Johannesburg. She's at the University of Johannesburg at a conference, in fact. So she stepped out of that. And I'm going to therefore let her really kick off when we start going through some of the issues that we are facing. But Noble joined us. She is a brilliant attorney. She's got an incredible track record. She's worked for many, many years with TISA as well, the Evangelical Alliance of South Africa. And she has an absolute heart and a passion for religious freedom. And we're so happy that this year she's been able to join us and to come in even on a part-time basis, but her contribution is invaluable. And the areas that she's going to be speaking about today are going to be two big areas that we're looking at the moment. One is a piece of legislation that you're probably no doubt aware of, which is GILAB, the General Intelligence Laws Amendment Bill, otherwise known as the Spy Bill. And that started off really, really, let's say, bad is the best way of putting it. The original version actually specifically identified churches and religious leaders as potentially the targets of it. But it's gone through really the National Assembly process now. It's gone through some public consultation. But I'm going to let Nobu talk about that. And then we're also going to be looking at and about to produce something which I hope will be very helpful in the build-up to the forthcoming general elections, which is a freedom of religion scorecard. And as you may know, 4SA is politically neutral. We don't support any particular political party. We work with every and any political party that is willing to also stand up for faith and freedom. And we've done so successfully with multiple parties over the years. But it's interesting when you look at the actual record on legislation and when you look at the record of what government departments are producing and regulations and policies and that type of thing, then you can start to see just measurably and objectively where the different political parties stand when it comes to this, what we believe is a critical and fundamental human right and a right guaranteed by our Constitution, of course, specifically in Section 15. So, Noble, without more ado, and having hopefully introduced you correctly, I'm going to hand it over to you. And if you could just take us through the GILAB and the Religious Freedom Scorecard, and then it can swing it back to me.
Thank you, everyone. Just quick apologies. I am at a conference and I asked, and it's being held in a library, and I asked for a quiet spot, and they said, unfortunately, they don't offer those. So I am what I think is the most quiet hallway, but it's still not very quiet. But I try to find a quiet place. So I'm just going to um, try and get through this quickly before the noise comes. Um, and so the first thing I'm going to talk about is the General Intelligence Laws Amendment Bill. And I'm sure I would hope that you followed the progression of that bill. And I'm just going to give a very quick history of the bill and where we're at now and what the next steps are. The first iteration of that bill was very problematic. The bill initially intends to amend the intelligence laws of South Africa, and the claim was that it was engineered to deal with the issue of state capture and to protect the nation and make sure that the government has the ability to access information and deal with any threats as they arise. And in the first draft of that bill, the bill was horribly unconstitutional. They particularly included a provision that necessitated that if one wanted to start a church or NGO or any other such organization, they would have to undergo vetting processes. These vetting processes would include having your phones tapped, access to your financial records, access to your location movements, all this under the guise of national security. That version also had very broad definitions of national security and included very vague and strange language. 4SA made submissions to that first draft of the bill, along with other partners and civil society organizations. And the language was then changed, and then a second version was introduced of the bill. And the second version, unfortunately, was not much better, and in many ways is actually worse than the first version. And in this version, it allowed the definitions were very, very broad. They had broad definitions of national security, and national threats to national security, um, broad definitions that included items that were vague and would be easily open to abuse and interpretations by the intelligence agencies. There was very problematic, ill-defined terms such as potential opportunity, which obviously one can't define what a potential opportunity is. And they had strange definitions around how one could be considered a threat to this national security if they were trying to interfere with the desire of South Africans and living in a certain way. And once again, 4SA made submissions to have this changed, and we made very detailed submissions, which are available on our website if you want to see them. And we were also invited to make oral presentations in Parliament, which my colleague Liesel did an excellent job of that. And wonderfully, surprisingly, a lot of our recommendations were actually taken by the government, by the committee that drafts this, and they have introduced a third iteration of the bill. And this third definition of this third version of the bill is much better than the first two. They've done away with a lot of these strange definitions. Particularly, they've removed all definitions of issues around potential opportunity, potential threats. They've removed the weird definitions of national security threat. They have removed all provisions necessary for vetting for general individuals and have focused their vetting on those who would have access to state information and those who would be working in government spaces. And they have changed this new definition, this bill, to move away from so much individual surveillance and are focusing more on mass surveillance, which is a massive win for religious freedom and a massive testament to the way in which public participation can work, and the importance of the work that 4SA, along with other organizations, do to hold government accountable, because they received over 23,000 submissions against this bill, which they obviously could not ignore, and they had to amend accordingly in terms of the Constitution. However, this third version of the bill is not exactly where we need it to be either. From a freedom of religion perspective, there are still some challenges in terms of who does get vetted. And it may open up particularly journalists who may still have to undergo this vetting process, which would affect journalistic integrity and anybody who may be considered to be working with the government with sensitive information. And sometimes that can naturally reach out to anyone doing any sort of reporting on the government or the state, or anyone who is working with information that actually needs to come out to the public, but then they'll go through this vetting process, and they would be blocked and prevented and sanctioned from that, which is obviously not great for any democracy. Secondly, the committee has failed, despite the incredibly broad and detailed and very well thought out definitions that were offered to it by 4SA and other civil society organizations, to clearly define national security, threat to national security. The definitions that exist are still very vague and are open to multiple interpretations depending on who is doing that interpretation. And so that is still an area of concern for us. Additionally, the bill talks about, has this current version is concerned with mass surveillance. However, there's still provisions in the bill that talk about surveilling individuals, which is it's a bit concerning and it's unclear, although this version of the bill is much better, because previous iterations of the bill did not provide any judicial oversight over any surveillance. This current version of the bill does clearly state that they would have to get permission from a judge, and there are certain processes, and they would have to inform the person who's being surveilled that they are undergoing surveillance for national security and potential threat to national security, or the vetting processes for one who is dealing with sensitive information. However, as stated, the definitions of national security and threat to national security are vague, and the continued insistence that there are provisions where an individual is surveilled, it is inconsistent with what is now supposedly the purposes of the bill. Also to note that South Africa already has legislation that deals with mass surveillance, which is the RICA Act, and there is certain uncertainty around how these two pieces of legislation will work together. And you will find that from other areas, from other experts who are not necessarily dealing with freedom of religion, there are still a lot more challenges with the bill, particularly around powers and authority, and who is able to, the powers that are given to the Inspector General and the way in which this unit works with the Office of the Presidency. Many argue that it's actually not going to deal with the issues that were fundamentally raised around protection of state capture and allowing the government to actually be able to curtail any threats that are internal and external. So currently that bill has gone through the National Assembly, and it is now sitting with the National Council of Provinces. And surprisingly and interestingly, they have opened it up to allow for further comment, which is going to go through till May. So that is open for comment, and 4SA will be making comments to this third version of the bill as it sits before the NCOP. Unfortunately, there seems to be a great desire to push this bill through before the next parliament, and so we are going to keep monitoring all of that. And yes, I think it's been a great effort by the 4SA team, and the work of this bill is actually a fantastic example of what public participation can do, and mobilizing mass people to engage and hold the government accountable for the type of bills that they're trying to produce. So that's the first piece of work. And then the second piece of work that is of interest is a religious scorecard that 4SA has produced. It's it's a political party scorecard. As Michael stated, 4SA does not affiliate with any political party. and this is not any campaign for any party, but all we have simply done is go through the Hansard records, Hansard being the parliamentary conversations, and pulled out the conversations that all the political parties have on particular bills that affect freedom of religion in South Africa. And we have collated all of this, and it is unfortunately, the visuals that our graphic designer is working on are not yet ready. We're hoping that they will be ready by next week, but they're not ready by today. I would encourage that you please stay on 4SA's website and follow our social medias as soon as this is available. But what this political party scorecard does is it allows believers to actually see how different parties vote on different issues. It allows one to have a deep sense of what political parties actually do, which goes beyond what their manifestos claim they do. And this is appearing into what actually happens in Parliament and the type of things that they discuss and the type of policies that they align themselves with, and the things that they think are sacred and the things that they think can be easily discarded in our constitutional democracy. So I do not, as I've said, the scorecard is not ready, but please keep watch of it. It's a very useful tool to get a deep understanding of the political parties' inclinations on certain issues, but also a deep sense of the type of work that 4SA has been doing, because in each of these bills, 4SA has held the line. They have made submissions, they have engaged with the parliamentary committees, they have called on partners to also let their voices be heard for each and every single one of these different pieces of legislation that have potential to massively affect religious freedoms. And once you get a look at those scorecards, you'll be able to see just how much happens in Parliament that actually 4SA and a lot of our partners are holding back and fighting the fight for freedom of religion. Thank you. That's it from me.
Thank you, Nubu. And Nubu, would it be possible for you to maybe just give a couple of examples? I mean, we've had some real, let's say, maybe lowlights would be the best way of putting it, in the form of, let's take, for instance, Papuda, the Papuda Amendment Bill, or maybe the hate speech bill. Could you maybe just give us a sense of how that's worked? Because I know we've got multiple examples. I thought maybe we could just look at one or two just to cherry pick.
Okay, I think one of my favorite examples that is the Domestic Violence Amendment Bill. And in the original bill, there was an issue of spiritual abuse, the definition of spiritual abuse that was very problematic. And that bill, the first iterations of it were opposed in Parliament by a few political parties, but 4SA did some work to ensure that that definition of spiritual abuse was removed and changed, because it was very problematic and could have been open to all kinds of interpretation. I'm just going to go through some of my favorites, Michael. Another one is obviously the hate crimes and hate speech bill. The bill has very broad definitions of what could constitute harm, unclear definitions of hate, and very harsh sanctions for one who could be found guilty of this crime. And the number of years are quite high. I think it's 5 years now. And this is a bill that a number of political parties opposed and quite a number supported. And there is issues around the definition of hate speech, which is unclear, and the sanctions are too high for a definition that's so open to abuse and so broad, and will likely land on religious issues. The bill currently is awaiting the president to sign. We don't know if he'll sign it. 4SA made submissions at every stage of this bill, even up until it was passed by both houses of parliament. 4SA reached out to the president himself and asked him to not sign it and use his presidential powers to refer it back because of the glaring constitutional issues that this bill holds. And so currently we are waiting to see what happens. If the president signs it as is, it's likely going to trigger some serious constitutional challenges on such broad definitions. There's also, as I've already gone through, GILAB, the General Intelligence Amendment Bill. We also had the Cyber Crimes Bill, which also included very broad definitions and problematic definitions around malicious communications, which were very broad and would have potentially been used to violate freedom of religious expression online. And 4SA made parliamentary submissions to that, and it has since been passed. And it was strongly opposed by a number of political parties. But as you know, that in Parliament, with the way in which Parliament has existed so far, it doesn't really matter what many of the small parties do because the ANC had an overwhelming majority. So these next elections, as we vote, are an interesting opportunity to consider how we balance our constitutional rights to ensure that voices of even the minority can be heard and have meaning. Another piece of legislation that we worked on was the Protection of Constitutional Democracy Against Terror and Related Activities Amendment Bill. The bill contained very broad definitions of what a terrorist attack could be, and these could easily be used to curtail religious freedoms. And once again, 4SA held the line, we made submissions. It was also strongly opposed by many political parties. However, it still passed through Parliament. And there was the General Laws Money Laundering Bill, which also gave broad powers to the state to allow the state to be able to prescribe a religious organization's founding documents, which we can all clearly see how that would be very problematic in the formulation of churches and having a government that controls the way in which churches are formulated and the way in which churches deal with their finances. This was actually one of the few bills that was opposed by every single opposition party, except the ruling party. But everyone opposed this. And unfortunately, it still passed. Yeah. And there's still some bills that are up in the air that we're waiting to see what happens. There are some interesting bills that were proposed. There was a Disaster Management Amendment Bill that was a private member's bill that was proposed. And the aim of the bill was to constrain the powers of the executive because of everything that happened with Parliament. It was supported by a few parties and opposed by a few, but ultimately, because it was opposed by the majority party, the bill was rejected. But it had the potential to introduce interesting constraints to these executive powers, and we saw what they could do during COVID. But unfortunately, that bill was rejected and was opposed, so it didn't pass.
Well, thank you, Noba. That's really great. And I know that you're also looking at some of the actual departmental policies that have been formulated as well. Is that correct?
Yes, so there's also certain departmental policies that have come up that are very problematic. And now the difference between policies is that a bill needs to go through the different houses of parliament to become an act, and there's very strict public participation requirements for those. However, policies, whilst public participation is invited and encouraged, the test for it is not as strict as an act. And so a lot of departments are able to get away with a lot of bills what not bills, but policies that are very problematic. So you've got things such as the ECE toolkit, which Michael will discuss later. You've got the anti-discrimination protocol that the Department of Basic Education worked on. You've got learner pregnancy policy that was also problematic, and you've got the SOGI guidelines, and SOGI stands for sexual orientation, gender identity expression, and sex characteristics in schools. And so you've got those guidelines as well, and those are a policy that comes up, and it's because it's not an act. Often the government believes that they can get away without having very clear public participation in those policies. And you can have also certain provincial policy guidelines that come up. You can have regulations. Regulations are generally gazetted for people to comment on, but you did have regulations such as the Films and Publications Amendment regulations that were also problematic that came up, and most people don't tend to engage with regulations as much as they would act. There were also the Draft Health Regulations Act. The draft health regulations from the Department of Health that had some challenges, and there was a victim support bill that came from the Department of Social Development. And so some of these are, the regulations, they do call for public comment, but it's not as engaged, it's not as involved as you would have if you're having an act, such as the Department of Home Affairs also has the Green Paper or White Paper and the draft immigration regulations that have recently been promulgated, which all of these areas can affect religious freedom, but tend to sometimes fall under the radar because it's just a policy, or they are covered under regulations, and the government can issue shorter comment times because it's regulations and it's not an act, and they can get away with speeding these things through. And sometimes the meat of the law lies in the regulations and not so much the big acts.
Noble, thank you so much. That was a really very great comprehensive overview. And I think if one thing I think becomes very clear from that is how much legislation, how much is shifting, how much law has the potential to basically erode and therefore threaten our right to religious freedom. So I'm going to just let Noble go if she hasn't gone already. I know that she had to get back to the conference, but Noble, thank you so much. If you want to just wave to everybody and say goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, Noble is a tremendous asset and a resource to 4SA and I believe to the nation. So I hope that part was helpful. As I say, I'm sorry that we haven't got the actual graphic yet. We've had a lot going on, and as you probably are aware, 4SA is a very small team. So I think some people think, perhaps because of the amount of stuff that we do and that we churn out, that we are this large team of like with a national footprint. I was asked the other day, where our office was in Bloemfontein. But actually, at the moment, just so you know, 4SA consists of me. Nobu is 2 days a week. Liesel Pretorius is full-time, and then we have an administrator that helps us too. So that is basically 4SA. We lost at the end of last year Daniela Ellerbeck, who many of you will know, who did a fantastic job. She was with 4SA for 7 years. But I think the amount of work and the pressure of the work, not just the time pressure, because often it is very pressurized. You're dealing with deadlines that you don't set, and we get X days that are just given within which we have to make submissions or comments, and the work is very, very stressful in that sense. There's a lot of spiritual pressure. A lot of us have faced perhaps situations in our personal lives where you wouldn't normally perhaps have such extreme levels of let's say, attack. And unfortunately, Daniela, I think at the end of the day, after 7 years, just felt that she really had done what she could do, and God bless her. And she's now moved on, and she's got a great position with another non-profit organization. Similarly, you might recall our advocate Nadine Badenhorst also similarly just took a view that she wanted to move and shift on. So we are a very thin line, and part of that thin line is obviously the resources. We are still every month looking at our balance sheet, trusting God. We've made it thus far. By the way, we've been doing this 10 years. Can you believe it? Praise God. So God is incredibly faithful to us, and I believe to his church. But nevertheless, it is long hours, onerous. I work on average, I would think, at least a 60-hour week, simply because there's just so much to do and the pressure is right there. So any support that you can give us, please, in prayer. We certainly need prayer. It's definitely, the fight is not against flesh and blood, it is against principalities and powers. And I think to a very large measure, 4SA is literally standing in front of the perhaps most critical agendas that the enemy is seeking to bring into nations, and we are just one of them. You can see it's a global trend. So we fight the good fight of faith. We fight for faith and freedom, but every support that you can give us, please do consider that. I want to move on to something now, which I think is probably the most concerning thing that we're dealing with at the moment, and it's certainly occupying much of my time. I actually was supposed to be in Joburg, but the media storm at the moment meant that I felt it was best to cancel that and rather wait for the weekend and then come up to Port Elizabeth rather than being in Johannesburg. But it's called, and you may be aware of it, and if you're not, I want to make you very aware of it. It's called the Early Childhood Education Toolkit, known as the ECE Toolkit. And I truly believe that the greatest battle that we're in at this point in our history is the battle for the next generation, is the battle for the minds and hearts of our children. We deal with these other bills, and you've probably seen and heard and understood the seriousness of those bills. But typically, when you have a bill, let's say the hate speech bill, God forbid, but let's supposing it gets passed, it is possible that somebody may be targeted. And we are still pressing back against the president in the hopes that he will simply not sign this bill, because it's only law once he signs it. But it has now passed through both houses of parliament, and it is waiting his signature. It is still got all the bad things in it, unfortunately. There is a small defense for religious speech, religious expression, but it's inadequate, to be honest. It literally says something along the lines of that you are not guilty of a crime of hate speech for something that you may say or express that is a bona fide religious expression, unless it amounts and falls within the definition of hate speech in this hate speech bill. And that is very broadly defined. So to give you for instance, one of the definitions of hate speech given in the hate speech bill is that if you say something about one of the protected categories, and again, very, very large numbers of categories, very vague, gender identity, gender expression is all in there. If you say something that causes somebody substantial emotional harm, then that could lead you to face criminal prosecution, and if convicted, up to a 5-year jail sentence. What is substantial emotional harm? Well, is it deeply offending somebody? Somebody's feelings are very badly hurt? You know, I challenged the Deputy Minister who's responsible for this bill, the Deputy Minister of Justice, John Jeffrey, because the other problem is that the word hate is not defined in the hate crimes and hate speech bill. How can you have a law about hate crimes and hate speech where hate is not actually defined? And I asked him, what is the definition of hate? Why is there no definition of hate? And he said, well, you can look it up in the dictionary. And I said to him, well, I hate cabbage, but, you know, I mean, the hate is a very broad concept. You know, the constitutional definition of hate speech is an advocacy to hatred. In other words, I'm encouraging you to hate somebody or some group with an incitement to do harm, typically some form of violence. But this is so vague and so broad. It's easier, believe it or not, to be prosecuted successfully for hate speech if this bill goes through than it will be for you to be forced to make an apology or to pay a fine under the civil hate speech definition, which is part of the Equality Act or PAPUDA. It's a crazy bill. And yet this is where the battle lines are in that sense. But back to where I was speaking, which is the battle for the next generation. We discovered it a while ago, but we were careful to just make sure that we understood the issues and also to make sure that we engaged as best we could with the people who will be perhaps the most affected by it, and to find out who would be willing to stand alongside and with us. Because for us, we are a legal advocacy group. We basically define what the law says, but we're very dependent. Once we define what the issues are, once we look at what the law says, the applicable law, and when we see where we can actually push back, we are so dependent upon the faith communities to rally to the standards, so to speak. And when we do, by the way, as Noble has pointed out a couple of issues, it's very effective because there is something which I call a golden key, which is that in our constitution, and most people aren't perhaps as aware of this as they need to be, we don't just live in a cycle where every 4 years we tick a box and some political party gets into power and then they do what they want for 4 years. And if we don't like it, we put a tick in another box next time around. No, that's not how it works. That's why public participation is so key, because it is actually baked into the Constitution. That is why we have the opportunities that we do to speak into the bills, to actually make submissions and to lobby. What government obviously has been used to doing is to just stick something in the Government Gazette. Where is that exactly? Has anybody read the Government Gazette lately? Do you look at it every single day? Well, of course not. Nobody does. And that's how so much of what has actually happened in this nation in terms of bad legislation has got through. But we look at it every day. And one of the things that, of course, we can therefore do is we can engage in the public participation, and we can ramp up the level of that public participation. When we get big numbers of people, that we mentioned the draft health regulations. You might remember that those regulations were going to give the Minister of Health the same powers, in fact, greater powers than Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, the culture minister, had enjoyed under the COVID lockdown disaster management regulations. He was going to get even greater powers, no accountability to Parliament, no oversight of the judiciary. When those regulations were published, which they had to be, we mobilized, and 350,000 people sent in individual submissions. It killed it, which is wonderful. That's why when we raise the standard and we say this is the time for the public to participate, to push back, if we sit and say nothing, then basically we're just left living with the results. And those results are typically not good. So let me get back to the ECE toolkit. This is an education training program. It's a teacher training program developed by a unit within the Department of Basic Education that has been specially set up. It's called the Social Inclusion and Equity in Education Unit or Directorate. I have been in one of the meetings. I know another Christian organization called Cause for Justice who was in the meetings. The vast majority of people advising this unit are from the LGBTIQ plus community, which means that the policies, the so-called guidelines, these toolkits, these protocols that are coming out of this unit obviously have a single ideological bias, and that is deeply problematic. Now, I'd like to just perhaps step back and say that, of course, we are not anti-LGBTIQ plus. Sexual orientation is a protected category under the Constitution. Same-sex couples are entitled to marry under our laws. They can adopt children. They have all the rights and privileges of heterosexual couples. So nobody's contesting that. What we are contesting, well, I mean, some people are, but 4SA isn't, because it's not a religious freedom issue, strictly speaking. What we are contesting is the fact that when it comes to education, the government has no right or certainly right would be. I mean, power, yes, they have, but they have no right to impose a single ideology in and through the education system. And that is what we're seeing increasingly happening. And we discovered this training toolkit. I'm just going to give you a couple of quotes from it so that you get a sense of what we're worried about and why I think we should all be worried. I'm just going to call this up quickly if you give me 1 minute. Here we go. So some of the things that it will do, for example, it specifically is designed to help little children, as it describes, break free from harmful gender stereotypes, which hold them back in life. And presumably, those harmful gender stereotypes will be those that they have been taught by their parents and by their faith communities. It will teach children to ask learners from a young age for their preferred name and pronouns. It says that teachers must use they, them pronouns to let children know, and I'm quoting exactly, that we cannot assume someone's gender identity just by looking at them. Teachers are told to work with children to foster an understanding of gender diversity. They must show pictures to show how different people can be sort of, let's say, non-gender compliant, for want of a better word, to make room for children who are exploring their gender identity, to make sure that they demonstrate that gender identity should not be assumed. It includes teachers encouraging children to use toilet facilities that correspond with their gender identity. Now, we, for ECE, we went with a coalition of people from the different religious communities. We went with the United Ulama Council. Now, I'm talking about, when I say went with them, their senior leaders or their secretary generals were represented at the meeting. They represent 1.8 million Muslim people from all the Muslim groupings. We went with the leadership of TISA, the Evangelical Alliance of South Africa. That's Reverend Moston Clark, who many of you will know. We went with SACOF, with Pastor Bert Pretorius. That's the South African network and fraternals of Christian organizations. They represent about 5 million. TISA represents about 4 million. We went with Nkululeko Yizizwe Association. They represent the African traditional faith structures. They represent up to 10 million people. So we literally sat opposite the Department of Basic Education. And we said, look, you're teaching little children these things because you can't just claim, which is what they do, of course, that this is just a teacher training program. They claim that this is just, and therefore there is no need for public participation. But we said to them, no, this is not Blackboard training, some new Blackboard technique or some other thing like that. You're actually training teachers to create a culture in the classroom of transgenderism. And you have no right to do that, certainly not if you're overriding the rights of parents. Parental rights is, of course, a critical element of religious freedom. It's guaranteed in international. It's guaranteed by South African law. It's guaranteed by the department's own white paper policy, which says that parents have the right to choose, the inalienable right to choose the form of education that their children will have, particularly in the early years of childhood development. And it also includes, by the way, the cultural and linguistic elements of that education. So the Department of Education's duty is to actually uphold the rights of parents to educate their own children with their own views and values and to consult with them. None of this has happened. And so we went with the department and we actually presented them with this document. I don't know if you can see this document. It's a 35-page comprehensive position statement on why this early education ECE toolkit is unconstitutional and deeply problematic. We were basically told, after being made to wait for nearly 3 months, during which time, by the way, we also were approaching the presidency, we were approaching the Minister of Education herself. They basically came back and said to us that they will continue with this. They said that they had to do this, and the reasons are very, very spurious. For example, they said this is a core element of their strategy to combat gender-based violence and femicide, which is extraordinary. How on earth do you prevent gender-based violence and femicide by teaching transgender ideology to little children? We're talking about 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old children here, 8-year-old children here. How on earth does that stop or prevent or reduce gender-based violence? As I pointed out to Elijah Mshlanga, the communications director from the DBE, that if you're basically teaching that there's no such difference between boys and girls and men and women, it's all in your mind, it's purely subjective, it's whatever or whoever you think you are at any stage, then who is actually gender-based violence intended to be aimed at, so to speak? Like, what are you trying to, what do you mean by gender-based violence? If there is no such thing as gender, then what are you talking about? And of course, the answer was, well, it's violence against women. But if there's no such thing as women, if a woman is just a social construct, then it's just violence, right? I mean, they don't think these things through at all. And of course it's not. It's an ideology. It's an imposed ideology. It's a single ideology. It's a deeply dangerous ideology, because if you can persuade a child that they literally cannot believe their eyes, that they may be sitting looking at a little girl and the teacher saying to them, well, that little girl actually could be a little boy, and so could you be a little girl if you want to, Johnny. How is that going to actually help a child? Surely that will not just deeply confuse a child. It may permanently damage that child, because as Aristotle said, give me a child until the age of 7 and I'll show you the man. At that stage of a child's mental development, they've got no possible way of processing that sort of information. How is that in the best interests of the child? How is it in the best interests of a child to basically tell the child that what the parents are teaching them is harming them and holding them back in life? How is that in their best interest? And these are, by the way, the paramount constitutional considerations that the department is supposed to be taking on board, but it's not. They've doubled down. They've said that they're going to continue it. They said that in their response to us that they believe that they have the right to supplement the values that parents are teaching with constitutional values. They've said specifically that they believe that the religious freedom rights of parents can be limited. This is something which we have to fight, because we're not just fighting for ourselves here, we're fighting for the next generation. So I don't know whether or not you've engaged with the campaign at all. I don't know whether you've looked at the 4SA website and some of the stuff that we've said about this, but we do have materials that you can use in your churches to alert your people. We really want to encourage you to do so, even on Sundays, to perhaps get people. There's a slide that we can send you, an image that you can put up on the screen. People can scan it and go straight to the website. It takes 2 minutes to make a submission. The one thing that we did get from the department was an address that people can write to. And we've again teamed up with the Dear South Africa platform. So you can literally take 2 minutes and you can send a comment or an email or your views through to the Department of Basic Education and let them know whether or not you're happy with this. And let's hope most people are not, to be honest. So that's basically, that's where we are. The Department of Basic Education came after us a couple of days ago. They sent out a tweet and memes and everything saying fake news across the South Africa website. I then took the same meme and I replicated it, and I just put fact check across the same thing and referred people to our website where you can actually read exact quotes that come out of this ECE toolkit. So again, please engage with this campaign. We must drive up the numbers. If enough people, if enough parents, if enough people who care about their kids are actually writing in and engaging, then we have the opportunity, I believe, to stop this. And stop it we must. What's been asked for, by the way, is not only to stop it, but for the establishment of a family values unit within the Department of Basic Education. It is so important that we actually get on the inside of these things, because education is the key battleground. If you can drive a wedge between what parents believe and what their children believe, then you can literally cut off the transference of the values and the faith of one generation to another. And I think as Christians, that should be something about which we should be deeply concerned. because it's happening right in front of our noses today. Anyway, let me pause and stop there and hand it back to you, Trevor. And if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask on this or any other thing, then I will do my best to answer.
Thanks, Michael. Just unbelievable how much work's been done. You're almost taking on the National Assembly yourself. So, yeah, we watched you over those 10 years, and it's just phenomenal what you've done. It's unbelievable. But I think we go around the room and just ask everybody who would like to ask something. So, Eddie, if we can start with you. You made a lot of notes for all of us. So I'm sure you would kick off us.
Hi, Michael. Thank you. Eddie Daniels, Anglican Bishop of Port Elizabeth. I think it's imperative that somehow from my office, for example, that I seek to communicate a lot of the sentiment you've just expressed to as many people as possible. Do you have a template for a communique to alert people to the reality of what lies behind the DBE's intention here? That could assist me with writing a pastoral response to folk. You're muted.
Just unmute.
Thank you, Bishop. The answer to your question is yes, we do. Sometimes it like you can't give people too much information because people just don't read, unfortunately. So we have got on our website, which is forsa.org.za, we do have a special landing page. You can get there right off the homepage. It just says ask more information. And that will give you, some of the perhaps most concerning issues that we see about this particular piece of so-called teacher training. We're also going to be producing, and I'm hoping to send them out today, and Trevor, you will get this. I send Trevor and Dan as well, for that matter, are on our communication list, and we send them whatever we can in the hopes that that will also then go to everybody else so that you will have all the stuff that we put out. But we're going to do 2 infographics where we're going to basically, as I say, having been accused of fake news by the DBE, we thought that we would respond with a fact check campaign. So we've got 2 infographics that are going to go out with basically just quotes directly out of this training material. We're not embellishing it. We're not, trying to sort of blow it up any more than it is, so that people can judge for themselves and make up their own minds and then comment. And yes, there is a way to comment. And that way, again, is through the 4SA website. There's a button on it which says, have your say. Maybe I could just take a minute. I don't know if I can if I can screen share, Dan. Is that possible?
You can share.
Or Trevor?
That's fine.
Okay, so let me quickly try and screen share something. I'm not very savvy with all this stuff, so you'll just have to bear with me a minute. I'll try and figure it out. Okay, so screen share, there we go. Okay, all right. So if you can see this, this is the 4SA homepage, and right on the homepage, right at the top, you've got a slider, and it says the Department of Basic Education is training teachers to introduce transgender ideology into pre-primary and primary schools. Do you support or oppose their initiative? If you say more information, then and I hope, again, you can see that page changing. It takes you to a page. And Bishop, this is where you can get some of the information, because there's a video of me just outlining it for people who want to watch rather than read. It gives you the background. By the way, this is funded, as is often the case, by an international organization who've given 40 million. We know that there's more money being pushed into this as well, by the way. And these are some of the, let's say, the quotes from it and the concerns that they express. There's a brief section on the legal framework, which is absolutely 100% behind parental rights. There's a section of the demands of the faith communities from the coalition that went and met with the Department of Basic Education. There's some of the DBE's response, which is quite extraordinary. if you read some of the things that they say are the reasons behind what they're doing. One of them is that they say it's necessary because, and here I quote, all children find themselves in unequal power relations that hold them back from exploring and developing their potential. I think what they mean there is that in the typical family, children are not in the same power relationship with their parents on an equal level. Yes, that would be very true, and for very, very good reasons. But anyway, and again, when they wrote to us, extraordinarily, they said in capital letters, look at that, the department will proceed. That's like a shout. I mean, there's no question or compromise. The other thing which you can do, of course, as I said, if we go back to the home page, is you can have your say. If you click that, takes you through to the Dear South Africa platform, where you can actually spend 2 minutes to comment and send your views through. As you can see, we've had 9,200 already. That's pretty good, have written in. And you can simply just put your concerns in. You have to look at your region, your suburb, you select your answer. What's your top concern? Complete absence of public consultation, undermining of parental rights and family values, undermining spiritual religious values, establishment of the DBE social inclusion unit. Bear in mind that they have refused to establish the family values unit. They say that they can't promote any form of religion other than secularism, which is, of course, a religion. So then you just put in your name, your last name, your cell number or your email so that you can get feedback, not so that it can go to the DBE. And then you also have an open comment block here where you can put in anything else that you like. This is just a sort of a free type place. So that is the platform that we've set up to help, and then you just click send. That we hope will be helpful for you to be able to get this word out. As I say, there is something else that we've developed, which is an image, and I've sent that out, which is a slide that you can put up on Sunday, and it's got a QR code. And if you click the QR code, then that will take you straight through to the Dear South Africa platform that I've just shown you, and people can make comments.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Edith. Let's go to the screen, Don. Have you got any questions there? Can Don hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry, trying to find the unmute button there. Thank you so much, Michael. Nice to see you. Nice to see the rest of you as well. Eddie, I see you sitting there. And thank you so much for the participation. I appreciate two things in this morning, and I think I'll obviously chat to Mark, our senior pastor, who's also online here, about the fact that we need to mobilize our parents. As you know, we have a school with just under 500 students here as well. We can mobilize those parents as well. And I think you've made it user-friendly, and I appreciate that with all the past things. And I realized doing it with your assistance and help how much work has gone into this, in trying to streamline it and make it as brief as possible to just get the interest of the people and then send them to a link where they can actually help. So that's what we obviously would like to do, and as we have done previously, to help mobilize as many people as possible to do this effectively. The second thing I also just want to comment on is I appreciate your scorecard with regard to religious freedom in political parties. So if you can circulate that widely once you, and I think it was said that that will be available in the next week or so, that would also be helpful for us in preparation for the elections that are coming up at the end of the month, that at least that's one of the check things. Because one of the things I realized with 50 political parties, not many people are going to sit down and read 50 manifestos, but at least give them some criteria by which to determine how should I vote in the upcoming elections, without being too specific, because I know that there are those who say put up all their moral stances and all their value stances. I just want something like this to be made available as well as a further tool to educate our voters, because more often than not, people do not vote not because of apathy necessarily, but because of ignorance. Who do I vote for? Who are they standing for? Without going to the trouble of actually investigating that. So thank you. That's going to be a helpful tool for us as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Don. As I say, I'm hoping that we are going to be able to launch it. I was hoping to have it ready today. I'm really pushing to have it ready. I'm going to be speaking at Pastor Richard Crompton's church, Word of Faith. There's going to be a kind of a Q&A type discussion, which is going to be broadcast. I think he's going to use his social media, YouTube, and other channels to do that. And that, I'm hoping, is going to be when we're going to be able to focus more on this religious freedom scorecard. As I say, it is just simply particular pieces of legislation where we have identified religious freedom has been under threat. And again, we're not pointing fingers at any political party because we're politically neutral. But obviously, from the way that parties actually vote and the things that they say, you can get for yourself a view as to how pro or not they may be for the right to religious freedom, which is obviously critical for the faith communities. So people generally, by the way, don't vote according to their sort of conscience. That tends to be quite far down on the list. But we just thought it was important to actually give an indication, just to add to the information that people, I think, can and perhaps should consider as they come to cast their important vote.
Okay, can we move on? Mark, have you got anything you want to ask?
Yeah, I just echo all the words that Don said, and thank you, Michael, for your ongoing work there. We really appreciate it, as does the rest of the faith community in South Africa.
Thank you.
I just have one question. We, as a church, generally get asked to promote and get on board with many, many things, and so a lot of our eldership meetings are spent trying to decide what we can and can't partner with. When it comes to 4SA, we generally jump on whatever you guys would say is important. And so what I'm hearing is that this ECE toolkit is probably, the next hate speech bill in that level, maybe even higher in importance.
Yeah.
So we would like to, as we do publicly, get that out and get as many signatures and comments as we can. I mean, I'm sure it's in the documentation, but just for the sake of time, how long have we got to get everyone mobilized to stand against us before it's too late?
Well, here's a slightly shocking thing. They've been pushing this since 2019. They piloted it in KwaZulu-Natal. So it's not a deadline. It's just a question of us using the momentum of the moment to build as much public opposition, I think, would be the best thing to do. So there isn't a deadline, but the more people engage and the quicker we engage, the more pressure we can put on the government to actually pull it back. We're asking for two primary things. Stop it. Stop training teachers with this ideology. And where it might be applied in schools, stop that too. And then thirdly, set up within the department itself a family values unit, because that will bring a balance to the diversity. We're supposed to be, and they talk a lot about diversity and inclusivity, but actually they're only talking about one particular brand of that. And we believe that actually this is necessary to make sure that we have the balance within what is critical, because this is educating the kids. So yes, thank you for the great support. Really appreciate that.
What they don't realize is that this drive for inclusivity is actually created exclusivity for everyone else, which is a strange thing that's actually happening. It's actually we're becoming more of an exclusive society into one view, and we're not allowing other views. So every battle is going to be an important one. Thank you.
Just precisely, and to make the point, this is not education, it's indoctrination. It's pushing one single ideology. And by the way, that is completely unlawful. 4SA already fought a case when they tried to push religion out of schools. It was known as the Oh God case. And that case established that there can be no single ideology imposed through the public school system, least of all by the state, by the way. But this is, again, subverted school governing bodies. It's subverted and sidelined parental rights generally. So we need to speak up at this time. This is the moment.
Okay, can we go back there? I see Mike Smith there and Rob Wild. Mike, have you got any questions? You want to unmute yourself, Mike? Okay, Rob, have you got any questions? No?
Thank you, Chair. Can I speak?
Yes, yes, carry on.
Michael, I'm very impressed with what you shared. I see that you've not mentioned anything about the Bella Bill. Because the Bella Bill and all those implications that you've spoken about, together with the Bella Bill, are going to affect children dramatically if it hasn't already started. I might have a bias here in that I stand for the ACDP, and we are unequivocally putting up our flag to say that we are standing with the faith community to stop these things. I think it's very important that we actually put across the perspective that we actually stop these things by changing the people in power. Example, in the Bella Bill, throughout when the NCRP did their roadshow, I read and I found out from Mari Sukkers, who's our MP in education, 96,000 emails were not looked at or added to the summons. So just by sending a nice email, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think is the solution anymore. They are not listening to you. They're not listening to the emails. Another thing is, if your email and my email have the same context, they see that as one email. So you can have 1,000 people sending the same email. They only see it as one email, so I believe.
It's not strictly accurate.
I just want to say that we need to take this thing very seriously. Throughout history, if you look at the Second World War, the First World War, the Korean War, all those wars, the people said that we're coming in peace. We're going to do this. Hitler said, don't worry, we're going to, and then he sent his. Now, that might be a little bit over the top right now, but I really believe that if we need to stop this and to change our country and to improve the schools, and I deal a lot with the schools in the northern areas of Port Elizabeth and those places, they're in desperate need of change. So I'm just saying, it's great that you are trying to do this and to talk about it, but I don't think anybody in government is listening right now. We need to change that.
Okay.
I'm standing in the executive for elections, and we need to go and stand in for the churches in the Eastern Cape, because we don't have that right now. We have people there that are not taking the stand for us.
Okay.
They're saying, but it's not happening. Now we want to go and raise our flag. Thank you, Trevor.
Thank you.
If I could just comment briefly on the Bella Bill and maybe just touch back on public participation. The reason 4SA didn't engage directly with the Bella Bill, we did originally, by the way. Originally, one of the most concerning clauses in the Bella Bill was that they wanted to centralize the capacity to rent or use or basically manage school facilities. They wanted to take that away from the school governing bodies and centralize it back with the MECs. That would have been a disaster because, as I'm sure you're aware, many churches rent school facilities, and they do that basically by direct negotiation with the school, and the school governing bodies obviously are the ones that approve that. If that had gone central, it would have potentially just shut down all use of school premises for churches, which would have shut down a lot of churches. So that was the one thing. But thereafter, the Bella Bill obviously is deeply concerning for parents. I mean, if you're in, let's say, homeschooling and that type of thing, there's a lot of very onerous things, and we're aware of them, but they're not strictly religious freedom issues. They sort of just fall outside maybe, and there's obviously a lot. But when you look at what's happening with the ECE Toolkit, you can see how this trend of just pulling back and subverting parental rights is just growing And this is, we see as obviously a direct threat. Just on the public participation, we don't sign petitions. If you sign a petition, you might as well not waste your time. Petitions are worth literally one submission. So you can have 100,000 people signing a petition, and that counts as one submission. However, if you write individually, even if you write pretty much the same thing, it does count. And when it's going to count is, of course, when a case, which I'm sure is going to happen sooner or later, and we always prepare, by the way, for litigation when we're making our submissions and when we're running our campaigns. Because according to the Constitution and according to constitutional court precedent, public participation must be meaningful. And if they just ignore, if government just ignores all these emails and just says, well, we're just going to count them as one, that's not meaningful. And that's what has yet to be challenged. But I can tell you now that when enough people write in letters, 350,000 people shut down the draft health regulations because they knew that they can't challenge that. And so we're waiting for the opportunity to have another constitutional court precedent set, which we believe will follow the trend, which is to say that government is accountable to the people. Our democratic system is set up so that government must at all times be listening to the will and the views of the people. So not to say that it's not important that the right people, aren't obviously in Parliament in the first place. When the righteous, I think the Bible says, when the righteous rule, the people rejoice. But nevertheless, please don't dismiss public participation. It is an absolutely critical element in this battle.
Okay, Jenny?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. The ECE toolkit, the training, would that just be government schools or would it include all schools in South Africa? That's the one question. And then, yeah, I'd really also love, as Ellie said, a link that we can put. We're involved in children's ministry. We would love to put it on platforms, and platforms can put it on other platforms throughout South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to answer your two questions. The first is that this only applies to teacher training for public schools. Obviously, private schools, it's a different story altogether. We would fight equally hard for example, Christian schools, because you are entitled as a private school to actually have a system of education, or let's say a context for the education, the ethos, the values that correspond to your particular faith. That's a fundamental religious freedom right. But what government does not have the right to do is to basically push one ideology or one faith or one anything into the public school system. So it's only public schools that we're talking about here. But I think you'll be aware that this is a kind of it's like a dye that's seeping into everything. And then to answer your question on the other aspect, yes, all the information that we have that we hope will be helpful to help people to comment and to push back is on our website. And I do send it out to Trevor particularly. And Trevor, thank you for convening and for the way that you actually do, let's say, pull everybody together and to help disseminate this information. So Trevor will get it and he will get it to you. And please engage with it. That would be fantastically helpful.
Thanks so much.
Mir?
Good afternoon, Michael. Thank you, and I concur with the work that has been done. I just want to take us back to the origins of why curricula is basically developed. Simply because from my understanding, ideologies of certain people determine what will our present kind of curriculum look like in the future. And you mentioned two very important statements, and it does leave the impression that the LGBTQ plus is the originators of trying to push the economics plus the gender preference through education in our country. That's number one. Number two is you mentioned three ways in which we can bring awareness into the communities, our constituencies. You mentioned the fact that we can use the website and individually we can push that agenda. Secondly, you also give us the awareness that we can educate our constituencies on the landscape of what this really is all about. And thirdly, you mentioned very briefly maybe constitutional courts as to the rights of parents, etc. My second question is really, is there any other methodology that you might have considered that we could look at? That's the second question with that. The third is, it's not a question, it's just a statement. Whether it's a public school or a private school, the church is the captive initiator of all facets of civil society, whether it be the child in a private school or the child in a public school. Our children's ministries capture all of those families' children. And so it's very much in our own interest not to be excluding our efforts just because maybe we have a private school and we will start our own schools. The gospel throws out the net and all fish will come into that net. And we need to be aware that those are the family values that the church stands up for and cannot allow ourselves to condone even the responsibility of parents. So I just wanted to put that in because I think if we can mobilize parents more and more by setting up meetings with them, but proper education is to let parents know. The reason why I'm saying that, Michael, is simply, I'm going to quote Oliver Tambo. There was a time that he mentioned a statement like, the weapon of the oppressor. Now that can be anybody who's oppressing somebody else. I'm not just talking about the political agenda. The weapon of the oppressor, the greatest weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And the issue with that is the fact is if we do not educate people that are oppressed through the present governments or future governments to come, we will always have people declare what our identity should be in the future. So I don't want to make an altar call now. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Can I maybe just share something again quickly on the screen, because I want to show you what we're going to be helping churches with. I don't know if you can see that image, but that is basically a PowerPoint slide or just an image that can be put up onto the screen that you can show people. If you take out your smartphone now and you scan that logo, assuming that it's big enough, that QR code, that should take you through straight to the Dear ECE. So that's, again, a way of driving up the amount of people who are going to engage with it. What we've also done to help, and I'm just going to try and identify something else now. So I'm going to just stop. As I say, I'm very technologically unsavvy, so I have to do these things one day at a time. Hold on. Yeah. So together with that, what we've done is we've also prepared a something which can be read out as an announcement. So if you can see this, can you see that? And again, the idea being that you can run the two together, because it's it's not easy if you're making an announcement to just remember everything off the top of your head. So what we've done is we've given you something. Obviously, you can cut it. It's pretty short. It just gives you some action steps. But again, if you could use those two things together, that would be something which you could actually run in churches. And again, I have sent these out to Trevor, and he's got them, and we can certainly therefore get them, both those things, to you. So that would be, that would be, I think, something which we hope will be helpful. And then the other thing that we have is is a notice that you could, because sometimes people don't actually have the capacity to do that. But it's called a it's just basically a poster. Can you see that, or is that are we must I stop sharing again? And I'm not sure what you can see. So let's try this. So yes, so there's actually a poster which you can print out, and again, you could maybe even print it out. You could print it out some A5-ish, and it gives just some examples, some information. And again, there's the QR code at the bottom, which people can just scan and go straight through, or you can go through via our website, as I say. So those three things, again, we have sent those out, and hopefully that will be helpful for you to disseminate this information a little bit more broadly.
Yeah, on this side, I'd invite everybody to check your emails. You may have it already. Bishop, any question?
Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, Michael, for the presentation. It's mind-boggling, to understand some of these things and the way you have presented them this morning. And for me, is do you at times feel that there are some elements within the governance structures who display antichrist tendencies, because of them understanding the fact that if Christians were to come to their senses and understand their mission and ministry, we would be able to see a better society. Secondly, it would be around what we've already talked about, the issue of us understanding the notion of people governing. Because the way that things are happening in the country, it seems like it is the political parties governing, not necessarily the people governing, because there seem not to be a clear kind of communication and link between the government and the people. We hear a number of these public participation and all those things, but in most cases, if the governing structures have made up their mind, I think the public participation is just a formality that is there. It seems not to be making the positive impact in terms of them changing their mind. Maybe it is very important for us to go back and understand, particularly as the Christians, that how do we really make sense to those in government and make them to understand that the freedom was attained by the assistance of Christians believing that people will be able to have a say in the way they live their lives. And the way that things are happening seem to be not going that direction. For me, then, it is very important to say we need to be able to find a way of, again, helping those in power to understand that. Fortunately, it is said in South Africa that we have got 90-something% of people who claim to be Christians. But why isn't that reflected in the way we get ourselves governed and the way that we live our lives? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. You made a couple of very good points, and if I could maybe just respond briefly. Firstly, public participation is a very, very good tool. And the fact that we have so many people behind 4SA is what gives us the opportunity when we go to meet with politicians from all parties to actually have a say and to make sure that our say is listened to. And the submissions that we've made have been very successful. Nubu Kosi was giving an indication of some of the really critical moments that have happened when the definitions and the perspectives that we have put forward have actually been adopted. And it's adopted because people know that behind us is not just, one or two people. It's literally tens of thousands, if not millions of people. And so that has been helpful. It's very helpful to have, of course, people who are sensitive and open in Parliament to religious freedom, particularly. So, there was one, and I'll give you one small example. In the domestic violence bill, there was a new crime mentioned, which was called spiritual abuse. Now, you can imagine, what do you mean by spiritual abuse? Do you mean that, perhaps the pastor took some money off me because he wanted to do his building fund and I was just overwhelmed, with emotion, and I was sort of felt blackmailed into doing it and I want my money back? Is that spiritual abuse? No, absolutely not. There wasn't formally no category of spiritual abuse. So what we did is we said that spiritual abuse should be defined, and we put the definition in as somebody who is basically, let's say, attacked or persecuted for having changed their belief from one faith to another. In other words, if you go from Christian to Muslim or Muslim to Christian, if somebody then comes after you for that, that's spiritual abuse. It just so happened that in the committee, when this was being discussed in Parliament, and they were now going to decide on this definition, that there was a member, that Steve Swart, who's a long-standing member of the ACDP, was there, and he took our definition, he put it forward as the definition, and it was universally adopted. So that was a tremendous win, because imagine once you get a definition like that, it tends to be like a virus. It goes all over the place into all sorts of other pieces of legislation. So the combination of working together, of having people in Parliament, of having the public participation, of having 4SA in particular actually at the coalface, that is our best defense of our religious freedom. Because as you correctly said, Bishop, we are a nation of Christians. We are a faith-based nation to a large extent. I think 80% is the figure for Christians. And I just would like to say this: religious freedom is a neutral right. In other words, it applies to all faiths, all beliefs, ideologies. Everybody is equal under the law. But of course, the reason why we do it, why I do it, I'm an ordained pastor for some 35 years now, is because I want to make sure that no matter what else might be able to be spoken in this marketplace of ideas, the gospel can be preached. Because when the gospel is preached and people hear the truth will set them free, and Christ will draw them to himself. So that's my personal motivation. That's why I believe that this is a vocation for me. It's a calling. I actually gave up being a pastor to do this. So yes, really do believe that we need to take a stand in our generation for the Christian faith. That's my personal motivation for doing this.
It's pretty good, Michael. Can we just, I've got 2 minutes to go. We could just ask you if there's something you would like to ask.
What I sort of been hassled with, or whatever, is Malema's outburst about Jesus at his rally, where he said, "We are all Jesus," and he came against Christians. Can that be taken as hate speech?
I think just about anything that Mr. Malema says will never be taken as hate speech. He said a lot more. He said a lot more egregious things than that. So, but again, I think that's why it's so important that we keep faith. We fight for faith. We fight for the freedoms of faith. We fight for the rights to share our faith and to preach the gospel, because it is only by doing that. The Great Commission, and I need not remind this august company, is to disciple nations. And it is therefore imperative that we can actually preach and spread and share the gospel widely and freely and without fear of sanction, and certainly without any form of limitation. So I just want to encourage us, let's keep doing what God's called us to do, and let's see our nations transformed to his glory. That's, again, me not with my 4SA hat on, I hasten to add, because we are faith neutral, but that's me with my personal hat on. That's certainly what I would love to and live to see.
Okay, last one.
Yes, we are continuously sitting playing tennis
and they just keep on throwing a new ball at us all the time. Is there not some way in which we as the church can repopulate the Chapter 9 institutions and make a major push that we then become the part of the process that prevents all this? Because the devil's keeping us wonderfully busy when we should be winning souls, when we're having to fight the gospel being messed up by these people and the community. Is there no way we can strategically look at that? Find ways on the council, you know, the one that with a very long, complicated name, and even the human rights organizations, those two, if we could get meaningful constituents on that. But those people are very carefully managed, but we need pressure to get people on that. That's the first one. And then the second thing is that I believe from what I read that the reason that they're able to do this is that they get lobby groups that pay them like 40 million rand to then accept this. And now they are embarrassed if they can't do that. They have to hand the money back. So we have to expose the fact that our Department of Basic Education is up for sale to the people who provide money.
Yeah.
And we have to expose that. No way we can't make that a major component. And then also, at some point, get legislation in place that says that lobby groups may not change our law by bribing government departments.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. We always say when we're looking for an agenda, follow the money. And again, here's another example of it. 40 million from a Belgian organization. There's more on the way, by the way. I heard the other day, there's a lot more on the way. And you might recall when we fought CSE 2019, there was a R500 million grant had been given to basically roll out a very liberal viewpoint on sex and sexuality into the public school system. And we managed to stop that, like we must stop this one, because enough people stood up and said no. And it forced them to go back through the school governing bodies, which is where the governance is supposed to lie. So yes, you know, follow the money, whether we'll ever stop it. The problem with it, of course, is, as you correctly point out, that money's not accountable money. So if the Department of Basic Education is given 40 million by an external organization, they're not accountable for the use of that money except to the external organization. And very often all these people want is for their agenda to be implemented. So you're right. It is, in a sense, an ideological capture of the government departments based upon the money, for which, as I say, there's no accounting to the public. They just have to account to the donors. So it is problematic. Whether it's going to be stopped or I don't know. They would probably argue that it's very important they get in this extra money because it helps them. And it's a two-edged sword. You know, I mean, on the one hand, it is a good idea to be able to give money for government, you know, to do good things. But on the other hand, as you say, if it comes with an agenda attached, then it's not so great. But yeah, follow the money, because it certainly gives you the motive, and it certainly gives you a sense of the people who have basically been pushing for it, what their views are. CSE, by the way, huge contributor to CSE, Planned Parenthood International, the biggest abortion and baby part selling agency in the world, multi-billion-dollar operation. What type of teaching do you think they would want to put into children about sex and sexuality? Obviously, they want as much, let's call it, you know, sexual freedom as they possibly can get, because that's how they fuel their business. So, yeah, we just have to always be aware that there is, unfortunately, the money issue behind many of these agendas.
Michael, thanks very much. I think my minute's up, or my 2 minutes are up. Thanks very much, Michael. I just to say to everybody, thanks for your contributions. We'll have this on YouTube. So if you want to study it, like we did with the business chamber, you can watch it on your own. It's all there. All that information is there. And then the other one is that what's interesting for me is thanking you, Michael. I've been watching the press And what they're saying about the church, with the vice president saying, we need the church to do more than just pray for us and pray for the election. We need the church to help us solve the issues of society, which I don't know how serious he was, but it was good. But the Sunday Times editorial also was more important to me, saying in a big heading in the editorial page, when this election's over, the politicians should talk to the church. I want to leave you with this challenge. What are you going to say when the politicians want to talk to you? So, Eddie, we
Can I?
Sorry, Mike. Yeah.
Can I just say one more thing? I think I'd probably be remiss if I didn't. If you value the work that 4SA does, then I would really ask you to consider how you might help us financially, because we are entirely dependent upon donations, which come from the church. To give you an indication, our average budget for a month is hovers around about 170,000 Rand. That has to pay me, a full-time attorney, a half-time attorney, an administrator, offices, travel, everything else that we do. It doesn't actually cover our expenses. Sometimes we have been literally 1 month away from closing, and by the grace of God, we've continued. We're a very thin line. And frankly, I think if we were ever to shut our doors, it would only be because we don't have the finances to continue. And I think that would leave a very, very big hole, because what's waiting out there in other nations, if you haven't seen it already, would come into this country like a tsunami. So please do consider how you might be able to help and support 4SA in the fight for faith and freedom. Thank you.